Hello, I hope you're all doing well. I just want to give a brief warning here that this video deals with topics such as sexual assault and consent. So if you aren't comfortable with that, I have other videos, or if you would like to skip particular sections, I'm going to have timestamps down in the description so you can skip to whichever section you'd like. If you're in the goth or alternative community, you've probably experienced this from one time or another. I know I have. There are some people who think that just because we're in the alternative community and we dress a certain way, that they're allowed to touch us and fetishize us. I, of course, cannot speak for the experiences of non-binary people and men who experience this in the alternative community. However, I did do a bit of outreach on my Instagram to gather other people's experiences, so I will have that to add as well. The amount of times I've had people catcall me, touch me without my permission, say weird shit to me just because I look different is insane. Just because I look different doesn't mean you're allowed to fetishize my body or touch it without my consent. I've had guys slap my ass, I've had random guys message me on Facebook and Instagram saying weird things that made me feel incredibly uncomfortable. I once had a guy come up to me whilst I was walking home from college and compliment my fishnet tights, telling me they looked sexy and fetishizing them, and it was incredibly creepy. I also had another guy come up to me and tell me that he was homeless and ask me if I'd have sex with him. So overall, as you can imagine, I've had some very weird experiences. But instead of just sitting here and complaining about my experiences, I wanted to share other people's experiences as well and try and break down why this happens and what plays into it. Of course, this is just part of a very important conversation, one that I feel is very important to both the alternative and the goth communities. If you have any experiences that you would like to add and feel comfortable doing so, please do. However, before I try and deconstruct why this happens, I feel like it's important to look at the stories of those who experience this kind of thing. So I posted on my Instagram story saying that I'm making a video about this topic, and anybody who has an experience they'd like to share is more than welcome to message me about it. So I expected about 1 or 2 people to message me, maybe. I had 6. I, of course, asked everybody who messaged me for permission to share their experiences, as well as giving them the opportunity to be anonymous if they would like to be. I'm going to try and portray their experiences as faithfully as I can, though I may integrate some of their experiences into my deconstruction in the next section, as opposed to addressing them here. Also, I'm really sorry if I keep on looking down. I'm looking at my notes so that I don't miss anything out. I'm also not going to censor or lessen any of the language or experiences used here because this is a topic that should be taken seriously and discussed properly. However, I am going to give a trigger warning for sexual assault, so if you would like to skip to the next section, the timestamp will be on the screen. The first one I would like to mention is Fetishizing, who said that she's experienced very little in real life. However, she said that her DMs are, as she put it, pure hell, saying that people message her about porn, fetishes, and asking her for sexual favours just because of her aesthetic. She has also had people obsess over particular pieces of her clothing, such as her leather coat, and even had one guy message her asking about a date that leads to you using my face as a sofa, which is disgusting. Some just random person messaging that to you. Fetishizing also mentioned that she's found the worst are alternative guys who seem nice but just want a big titty goth GF. She mentioned that these are the rudest and, come on, incredibly strong. I will also be talking about the big titty goth GF thing later in the video. Moving on, Annie told me that she's had people touch her hair without her permission. She's had strangers ask her to come home with them so that they can chain her up because, and I quote, her choker looked like she wanted to be asked those kinds of questions. What? What the fuck? She's also experienced people that were obsessed with this whole big titty goth GF vibe as well. She said that it felt like they had some kind of bucket list with the big titty goth GF thing on it and they needed to cross it out, which is why they were approaching her. Annie also mentioned this awful experience where 2 guys were following her home from a punk concert which was held in an alternative bar. One of them literally followed her to her doorstep, So she pretended that she was living somewhere else for her own safety. One of the people following her was actually talking behind her back about her clothes and her style as well. She ended up having to show them that she'd dialed 911 on her phone just to make them stop following her, and she's had this happen to her on 2 separate occasions. The third person I'm going to talk about would like to be anonymous, therefore I'm simply going to refer to them as Anon. They said that about a year ago they got involved in a guy who was a bit too old for them and who seemed normal at first. The guy would compliment their outfits and had a preference for their darker ones. As Anon got closer to him, they found that he had a fascination with fishnets, and that fishnets were everything for him. One day, this guy brought Anon clothes for them to wear for him, which were lingerie. Everything was pre-packaged and sealed, except for the fishnet tights. And you've probably guessed where I'm going with this and what happened. Anon discovered that he'd masturbated over the fishnet tights multiple times before handing them over, which is disgusting and vile, and how did he ever think that was okay? After Anon left him, they wanted basically nothing to do with goth fashion, because it reminded them of him. Apparently he would insert his fetishes into goth aesthetics with things like rape, BDSM, DDLG, and sexual promiscuity. So the next person I'd like to talk about is Lily. Her style is usually Victorian trad goth, so the majority of her body's covered. Even so, she still experienced these kinds of encounters. She's been followed by men while she was on her own at night. She's had men say things like, "You must be into kinky shit," followed by a wink and a creepy hand. Lily's also been sexually abused, stalked, and manipulated, threatened online and in person. However, she did point out that this didn't stop her from being who she is. Lily mentioned that she's also had more than one woman come up to her and congratulate her for still being active in the scene because they had stopped due to these reasons, which is really sad. And she said that she's lucky to have her male goth friends in the community who watch over her like big brothers, which is really sweet. And it's really nice that she has guys like that around her. So the fifth one I'm going to talk about unfortunately didn't get back to me as to whether or not they'd like to be anonymous. Therefore, I'm going to address them as Anon just in case. So she mentions that she lives in Mexico and violence to women is a sad but very common occurrence there. She mentions that she was once in a taxi and the driver started a weird conversation about alternative girls, saying that they were open-minded, as well as asking her questions that made her feel very uncomfortable. She felt very scared and asked him to drop her off early. Anon's also been harassed so many times by men, but mentions that this time was because of her aesthetic. So that's all of the experiences and stories I'll be sharing for that section. Moving on, there's one last thing I'd like to look at before deconstructing the reason behind all of this, and that is who is sexualizing and fetishizing the goth community. Unsurprisingly, I couldn't actually find any data on this topic as a whole, though I may have missed something because I have other things to do like uni work, so please let me know if I have missed things. Therefore, I had to try and gather my own data. Please bear in mind that I have a tiny outreach. I've only got about 410 followers on Instagram, so this isn't going to be terribly accurate. Thus, I can't gather data correctly. So this is only a tiny representation, and although it may not be reliable, it should hopefully give us some idea as to what we're working with. So I posted a poll on my Instagram saying, if you've been sexualized by strangers, who has done it to you? And as it's a poll on Instagram, I can only give 2 options. Therefore, they were normal and goth/alt. In the end, 42 votes, making up 95%, voted for normal, whereas 2 people voted for goth/alt, making up 5% of the overall votes. So whilst this is a minuscule amount of data, it does give us an idea of what we're working with. Please bear in mind that this may differ from country to country and community to community, so I'm working with what I've got, if that makes sense. So why does this happen? Well, goth and alternative folk have often been outsiders, especially in sort of mainstream media and things like that, have often been victims of violence in some form or another, whether that's bullying or being physically attacked. For example, I'm pretty sure most people, if you're from the UK at least, know about Sophie Lancaster, who was attacked in 2007 along with her boyfriend Robert by a large group of people. She protected her boyfriend, saving her life. However, she ended up dying later after being taken off of life support. The people who attacked them celebrated attacking them and even told friends that they'd done something good. They even said, and I quote, "There's 2 moshers nearly dead up near Backup Park. You want to see them, they're a right mess. At the trial, the prosecution said Sophie and Robert were singled out, not for anything they had said or done, but because they looked and dressed differently. I mainly included that just so you can see that, this prejudice towards people who look different is very widespread and very common. Violence towards the goth and alternative communities are quite prevalent and widespread. I'm sure quite a few people watching this have been bullied in some form or another because of their aesthetic. But what about the sexualization and fetishization of the community? There's one particular stereotype that I personally think is quite harmful, and I'm sure you've all heard of it or seen the meme or seen it in some kind of fashion, and that is the big titty goth GF. This stereotype is actually something that quite a few people I talked to actually mentioned, and it's something that I honestly think has become quite toxic towards the goth community. Yes, it started out as kind of a meme, but it's become something more, and it's become something that can be quite harmful. As Annie said in her experience, being with a big titty goth GF has become something almost like a bucket list or a goal. About 3 of the people that I've talked to have experienced the big titty goth GF stereotype in a harmful way, and I know I personally have as well. But why has goth become so fetishized? One of the people that I mentioned previously who would prefer to remain anonymous mentioned that one of the guys they were with connected goth fashion with fetishes such as BDSM. And I think that that's a connection that many of the people outside of these communities make. The latex, the chokers, the leather, the harnesses, etc. sort of are reminiscent of what mainstream media perceives as sort of this BDSM aesthetic, if that makes sense. But of course, these are just part of our fashion and are not indicative of our sex life, and they don't give anyone permission to touch us. I feel like the goth and alternative subcultures are often misrepresented and fetishized as a whole. I think a lot of this comes down to the objectification of goth and alt people, which to a degree explains why the perpetrators don't care about consent. Because you're treated like an object, something that they can freely touch and do what they want with. It's incredibly creepy and can be incredibly harmful. So of course, this needs to change. With people, we're not a fetish. We should be allowed to be comfortable in our own clothing as well. Just because we look different doesn't mean you're allowed to touch us without our consent, and you're not allowed to fetishize us and make us feel uncomfortable. We don't exist purely for you to objectify us and fetishize us, and honestly, doing that is incredibly creepy and disgusting. But I feel like it's a very important topic that needs to be discussed more. I would like to thank everybody who participated in this video, whether you messaged me with your experiences or contributed to the Instagram poll. Your contribution is invaluable, so thank you very much. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Stay safe. Toodle pip.